I have reviewed the GBI's initial findings in the investigation of a May 19th use of force case involving Bibb County deputies and the death of 30-year-old Keith Young. Numerous interviews conducted during the investigation revealed Mr. Young had threatened suicide several times since the fall of 2019 and had recently been hospitalized after holding a gun to his head and threatening to kill himself. He was discharged 2 weeks before this incident. Earlier on May 19th, the day of the incident, Mr. Young's wife had him served with divorce papers. In response, Mr. Young found his wife, physically assaulted her, and tied her to a bed, telling her that it didn't matter what happened to him because his life was over anyway. Investigators learned that in the hours leading up to the incident with the deputies, Mr. Young called his father-in-law and said, "If you don't shoot me, I'll shoot you." The evidence shows Mr. Young later intentionally drove his truck toward the deputies, speeding down a residential street toward where they were standing, in an attempt to either murder them or to force them to respond with deadly force so that his suicidal ideations would be carried out. The deputies were forced to choose between being killed or responding with deadly force. Their actions were justified, and no charges will be filed against the deputies stemming from this incident. In accordance with a policy that I set back in 2013, the GBI performed an independent investigation into this use of force. Their initial findings show that Mr. Young's wife, Casey, called Macon Bibb 911 at about 5:45 p.m. on May 19th. She reported her husband had hit her at their home on Bob White Road in South Bibb County, tied her to their bed, and had taken their 3 children. She said she'd gone to Brian and Janelle Kreitzer's home on nearby Carly Dawn to call for help. She also told the dispatcher that Mr. Young drove a red Ford F-150 pickup and that he kept a gun in the truck. Deputy David Dunn was dispatched to the Kreitzer's home. Sergeant Delana Calhoun and Lieutenant Leon Houston also responded. All 3 parked on the street in front of the Kreitzer's home. Mrs. Young also called her mother and stepfather, and they went to the Kreitzers to check on her. At about 7:15 p.m., the 3 deputies were standing near their parked vehicles when Deputy Dunn spotted Mr. Young's truck turn onto Carly Dawn. The truck slowly headed their way. Fearing a violent encounter, Sergeant Calhoun took cover in her car. Then the deputies and Mr. Keith Varnador, Mrs. Young's stepfather, heard Mr. Young gun the engine as he suddenly accelerated his truck down the street toward the deputies. A test of the truck's black box would later confirm that Mr. Young accelerated from a speed of 21 miles per hour to a speed of 52 miles per hour in a matter of seconds, and that he never hit the brakes. As Young drove straight toward the deputies, Brian Kreitzer stated that he saw Mr. Young with a gun in his hand, firing what he believed to be 2 shots at the deputies and at the Kreitzer's home from the driver's window of the truck. Mrs. Young and her mother, along with Mr. Kreitzer, his wife, and their 2 children, were inside when the shooting occurred. A Glock handgun was later recovered from Mr. Young's truck. Lieutenant Houston and Deputy Dunn drew their service weapons and began firing at the truck just as the truck crashed into the back of Lieutenant Houston's Dodge Charger. Due to the impact, the Dodge Charger was pushed down the road and into the back of Sergeant Calhoun's Ford Taurus, causing her to be ejected from the vehicle and for the car to be pushed into Mr. Varnador's Jeep with its back end on top of Lieutenant Houston's Dodge Charger. Mr. Varnador's Jeep was pushed forward due to the impact and it struck Deputy Dunn's Dodge Charger. Mr. Young sustained injuries during the car crash and shooting. He was taken to a local hospital where he died. His cause of death was a single gunshot wound. It's tragic that this incident resulted in Mr. Young's death. I'm glad Sergeant Calhoun's injuries weren't more severe and that no one else was injured. The investigation into this incident is ongoing, and I'm limited in what more I can say. However, with that in mind, are there any other questions?